Ethan's thumb hovered over the accept button, staring at Sarah's profile for the 100th time, his match with the perfect woman, or so it seemed. Her smile was radiant, her eyes inviting, and her bio spoke of things only a few people would understand, things that made him feel like they were meant to be. He ran his fingers over the screen, the words she had sent him earlier still flashing in his mind. "You're into vintage films?" "Me too. Ever seen The Night of the Hunter?" "It's one of my favorites." He had laughed when he read that. Few people his age knew the film, let alone cared about it. The conversations had flowed effortlessly since they first matched. Every message from her felt like a warm breeze in the middle of a long winter. But now, as he stared at her profile one last time, doubt crept in. Ethan, a 30-year-old software engineer, had been endlessly swiping through Tinder for months without much success. At first, he had hoped for a casual fling, but that never worked out. Eventually, he grew tired of the superficial connections that never amounted to anything. Every date ended the same way, empty promises, disinterested looks, and the inevitable ghosting. A few weeks ago, he'd decided he was done with the whole thing. No more Tinder. No more wasted time. But Sarah had thrown a wrench into those plans. She was different. They connected in a way he hadn't experienced before. She was charming, witty, and seemed to share his love for obscure hobbies, his passion for vintage films, rare books, and offbeat music. She even mentioned that she loved hiking in remote locations, which, to Ethan, sounded like the perfect adventure. Everything clicked, and he felt that rare spark that he hadn't felt in years. But now that the date was set, the unease began creeping in. Could it really be this easy? Was it possible that someone so perfect existed outside the confines of the digital world? Or was he just another fool chasing after something that didn't exist? The questions rattled around in his mind as he sat in his car, parked outside the location she had suggested. The place was secluded, a large, crumbling house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by thick trees and overgrown foliage. It had an eerie charm to it, the kind of place that looked abandoned but still had a strange allure. He ran his hands over the wheel, staring at the weathered structure in front of him. Was he making a mistake? He had the urge to drive away, to cut ties with this whole thing and just go home. But then, he felt the familiar tug of excitement. He was tired of being alone. Tired of second-guessing himself. He pushed the doubts aside and grabbed his phone, texting Sarah that he was here. She replied almost immediately, "Come around the back, I'll show you where to park." The words sent a strange shiver down his spine, but he shook it off. As he parked his car in the rear of the house and got out, he saw her standing near the back door. Her smile was just as warm as it had been in their chats. She looked even more stunning in person. Her eyes, a deep shade of brown, were filled with curiosity and something else, something he couldn't quite place. But that didn't matter. She was real, and she was here, just like she said. "Hey, Ethan," she said, her voice smooth and melodic. "I'm so glad you could make it." "Of course," he replied, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. He took a step forward, offering her a smile. "This place is, well, it's something." "Yeah," she chuckled. "It's been in my family for generations. I know it looks a little worn down, but there's something special about it, don't you think?" It was then that he noticed the door behind her was slightly ajar, leading into a dark, narrow hallway. "Come on in," she said, stepping aside. "I have a place downstairs where we can talk. It's more private." Ethan hesitated for just a moment, a strange feeling settling in his gut. It wasn't the type of place he'd usually agree to meet someone for the first time, but he had come this far. What could go wrong? After all, she seemed so genuine. He stepped inside, and she led him down a series of steps, the floor creaking under their feet. The dim light barely illuminated the space as they descended deeper into the house. The air grew cooler the farther they went. Ethan glanced around, taking in the bare walls and dusty floor. He was about to ask her how far they had to go when she stopped in front of a heavy wooden door. "This is it," she said, turning to face him. "I hope you don't mind. It's a bit secluded down here, but it's quiet." Ethan felt a twinge of discomfort, but he was also curious. "No, it's fine," he said, forcing a smile. As the door swung open, she motioned for him to go first. He stepped inside, and as soon as he did, the door slammed shut behind him with an unsettling finality. Ethan turned to face her, his heart suddenly racing. "Wait, what?" he started, but before he could finish his sentence, Sarah pressed a button on the wall, and the sound of metal locks clicking into place filled the air. The lights flickered and then dimmed to a dull yellow, casting long shadows across the room. Ethan's stomach churned as a cold, sinking feeling spread through him. "What is this?" he demanded, taking a step backward. His mind raced. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. Sarah stepped forward, her expression turning cold. "You should have known better, Ethan," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "But it's too late now." Before Ethan could react, she lunged at him. He tried to dodge, but she was faster than he anticipated. She shoved him into the wall with brutal force, sending his head spinning. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he felt lightheaded. "You didn't think it would be this easy, did you?" Sarah sneered, her eyes narrowing. "You were just the bait. And now, you'll be just like the others." Ethan's mind scrambled to make sense of her words. Bait? For what? With a sudden burst of adrenaline, he fought back. He shoved her off him and scrambled toward the door, but Sarah grabbed his ankle, yanking him back to the floor. Her grip was unyielding, like iron. "You're not going anywhere," she hissed. In the struggle, Ethan managed to break free. He bolted toward the corner of the room, desperate to escape. He heard her shout behind him, but he didn't look back. He found a small opening in the wall, a gap just large enough for him to squeeze through. He darted through the narrow passage and emerged into what looked like a control room. Rows of monitors filled the walls, each displaying different rooms and hallways within the bunker. His heart pounded as he took in the horrific sight. One of the monitors flickered, revealing a familiar face, a man he had seen on Tinder weeks ago, now trapped in the same situation. His eyes were wide with fear, his face smeared with sweat and grime. The realization hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He wasn't the first. And he wasn't going to be the last. Before he could process the full gravity of the situation, a hand shot out from behind him. He turned just in time to see another figure, someone Ethan hadn't seen before. The man grabbed him by the arm and twisted it behind his back, dragging him back to the bunker. "Did you really think you could escape?" the man snarled. "You're already in it, and there's no way out." As Ethan was dragged back to the dark room, the truth finally began to sink in. Sarah wasn't the mastermind. She was just a part of something far bigger. And now, he was tangled in a web of lies, deception, and manipulation far darker than he could have ever imagined. Ethan's mind raced as he was dragged deeper into the bunker. His body ached from the struggle, his skin bruised and raw where Sarah had slammed him against the walls. The narrow corridor twisted and turned like some kind of labyrinth, a maze designed to disorient. He had no idea how far they had gone, or which direction was even up anymore. His hands were bound with thick, coarse rope, cutting into his wrists, the sharp friction reminding him of how powerless he felt. The air in the bunker was stifling, a mix of stale concrete and dampness that gnawed at his lungs. He had tried to fight back, to reason with Sarah, but it was useless. Her cold eyes, the steely determination in her voice, showed him that there was no escaping her grip, not physically, not mentally. She wasn't the naive girl he had imagined. She was far worse. You should have known better, she had told him earlier, her voice slipping into something dangerously flat. You were never meant to leave here. Now, as she shoved him into a small, windowless room, Ethan realized just how deep he was in. He was no longer dealing with some misguided woman who'd made a mistake. He was dealing with a machine, a part of something far larger, far more sinister. His mind scrambled, trying to piece together what was happening, but the thoughts refused to align. He had come here looking for connection, and now he was trapped in the middle of a nightmare. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the room. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as the finality of it all sank in. He was locked in a cage. And worse, he was beginning to understand that this wasn't just some isolated kidnapping, it was part of a larger, well-organized operation. Ethan tried to fight the panic rising in his chest. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. He had been on Tinder, just like any other guy looking for a connection. Was this really how it ended? Was this how his life was going to play out? He could almost hear the voice of reason in his head telling him that he had to keep calm, but it was drowned out by the wild, gnawing fear tearing through him. He pulled at the ropes, straining against the rough fibers, but it was no use. Every twist and tug only brought more pain. He needed to get out of here. Time was running out. The room was dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb above him. The shadows stretched across the walls like silent sentinels, mocking him. There was no way to tell how long he'd been in here, an hour? Longer? The clock on the wall had stopped working. Ethan let out a frustrated sigh and slumped to the floor. His mind raced, trying to figure out his next move. The fear was overwhelming, but even worse than that was the sense of futility creeping into his thoughts. Ethan fought against it, but the weight of the situation bore down on him harder than the ropes around his wrists. He had no resources, no tools. There was no way out. His hands were tied, literally and metaphorically. He was in deeper than he ever thought possible. He thought of the outside world, the world he had left behind just hours ago. Was anyone even looking for him? His phone was dead, and even if it wasn't, he couldn't trust it. They were monitoring everything here. Ethan had already learned that much. He thought back to the small control room he had discovered when he first tried to escape, a room full of monitors, each one displaying different areas of the bunker. That's when it hit him. He wasn't the first. A low rumble of footsteps echoed through the hallway outside the room. Ethan held his breath, listening intently. The noise grew louder, but when he crept up to the crack in the door, no one was there. He strained his ears, but the sound had stopped. Silence pressed in like a heavy weight. He was being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. His gaze flicked around the room. It was small, practically empty except for a few pieces of old furniture, cheap metal chairs and a wooden table, both covered in dust. There was a door in the far corner, but it was locked. There was nowhere to go. No escape. The door rattled. The silence shattered when the door swung open and a figure appeared. Ethan froze, heart hammering against his ribcage. A man, tall and wiry, stepped into the room. His face was gaunt, pale, with eyes that seemed to glimmer with something darker than fear. The man didn't say a word, but his presence was enough to send a wave of panic crashing through Ethan. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, trying to mask the desperation in his voice. The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, battered phone. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Could this be his chance? The man held the phone out to him, and Ethan, desperate for any form of communication, reached for it. The man jerked it back. "You think you can just walk out of here, huh?" The man's voice was cold, mechanical. "You really think this is a joke?" Ethan felt a chill settle deep in his bones. What is this place? His voice was barely more than a whisper. The man grinned, but it wasn't friendly. It's not what you think. You're just one of many. With a sudden movement, the man lunged at him, grabbing Ethan's wrist and twisting it painfully. Ethan struggled against the man's grip, trying to break free, but it was no use. A surge of adrenaline shot through him, and with a primal yell, Ethan shoved his elbow into the man's gut, causing him to stagger back. Ethan took his chance and pushed the man toward the door. As the man stumbled, Ethan bolted toward the corner where he had seen the control room. His heart was pounding in his chest as he raced down the hallway, using every ounce of strength he had left to outmaneuver the man. Ethan was quick, he'd always been quick. He darted into the control room, slamming the door behind him. His fingers fumbled as he scrambled to locate the phone that had been left behind. He knew he had to act fast. He had to contact someone, anyone, before it was too late. His hands shook as he picked up the phone, but it was locked down. The screen flashed a message, access denied. Frustration surged through him, and his thoughts spun wildly. Why would they leave a phone behind if it was useless? What kind of game was this? Just then, the door to the control room slammed open. Ethan barely had time to react. The man from earlier had returned, a crazed look in his eyes. I told you, the man snarled, lunging at him again. You don't get to leave. Ethan fought back with everything he had, but as the man grabbed him by the throat, another figure appeared from the shadows. Sarah. Her eyes cold, emotionless. You should have stayed put, she said, her voice devoid of warmth. Now, it's too late. Ethan's mind raced. This was no accident. The man wasn't a victim, he was part of the operation. The realization hit Ethan like a bolt of lightning. The man had been pretending to help him, keeping him in line, making sure he didn't escape. Before he could react, the man hit a hidden button on the wall. The room locked down instantly, and Ethan was thrown back into a more secure part of the bunker. The door slammed shut behind him with a finality that felt like a death sentence. I told you, Sarah whispered, her voice almost tender. You're ours now. Ethan's head throbbed with the pulse of his panic as the room around him seemed to tighten. His chest felt like it was being compressed by an invisible force, and each breath came harder than the last. The walls were closing in, not just physically, but psychologically. He could feel the weight of the bunker pressing down on him, a slow and crushing force. Time was running out. There was no way to gauge how long he'd been here, trapped in this hellhole. It could have been days. Or hours. Or weeks. The thought made him sick. He could no longer tell where his body ended and the bleak walls of his prison began. Ethan sat on the cold concrete floor, his wrists still bound, his mind running in circles. He had tried everything, every corner of the small, secure room was checked for an escape route, every potential weakness exploited. The security systems were sophisticated, more advanced than anything he'd expected from some amateur human trafficking ring. Cameras had been installed in every corner, in every crevice of the room. Even the phone that had briefly given him hope was locked down. The screen remained a blank slate, the usual access denied, blinking at him with a mocking finality. He had tried to break into the system, cracking through the phone's security, hoping to send a message to someone, anyone, who could help. But each attempt had failed. The system locked him out faster than he could get any words typed. The bunker had eyes. It was aware of everything, every move, every whisper. Ethan had tried to memorize the access codes and patterns he'd seen, but there was no way around them. He was out of ideas, out of strength, and worse, out of time. The fact that he didn't know if anyone even realized he was gone was the worst part. It made him feel like a ghost, an afterthought in someone else's game. The realization that no one was coming for him hit harder than any blow he'd taken so far. The people who mattered, The ones he thought would come looking, would never know. His disappearance was just one more casualty in a world that had moved on long ago. Panic began to overtake him. His breaths came faster, more shallow. Sweat beaded on his forehead as his fingers twitched involuntarily. His heart thudded loudly in his chest, louder than the hum of the ventilation system or the low hum of the cameras overhead. He had no hope left. No way out. The thought of it was suffocating. Just as his mind threatened to shut down, something shifted inside him, something like a spark, an ember in the dark. The phone. A faint glimmer of a plan began to form. He could still use the phone. If he could break through the system, just once, just long enough to send a message, then maybe, just maybe, he could give someone a chance to find him. Someone would have to act, right? Even if the network was monitoring everything, surely they couldn't have everything under control. With a surge of renewed urgency, Ethan pushed himself off the floor, his body protesting the sudden movement. He staggered to the corner where the phone lay. His fingers fumbled for the device as his heart pounded in his ears. The phone's dull, metallic frame gleamed in the low light, the screen still black. His mind raced as he tried to recall the details of the encryption he'd seen before. There had to be a way. His fingers shook as he entered a string of characters he'd memorized from his previous attempts. Code after code. Line after line. He pressed the final combination. For a split second, the screen flickered to life, and then, nothing. His heart sank, but then, wait. The screen flashed again. A new message popped up. Access granted. You have 5 minutes. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the adrenaline shot through him. 5 minutes. That was all he needed. He began typing, his hands moving swiftly across the screen. Ethan Jennings. Location unknown. Trapped. They've been using dating apps to lure people. I'm in a bunker. Please help. Call the police. Get someone here now. He hit send. For one fleeting moment, he felt a sense of triumph. He was doing it. He was breaking free. The message was out. Someone would see it. Someone would come for him. It was his only shot. But just as the screen faded to black, his hope vanished with it. The battery icon blinked red, the percentage plummeting with terrifying speed. The phone was dying. He hadn't even had time to finish his message. He slammed his hand against the cold surface of the desk, cursing under his breath. No. No, no, no. Panic clawed at his throat again. The phone died in his hand, its screen going completely dark. It was over. And then the door to the room opened with a soft click. Ethan froze, heart thudding as his mind went into overdrive. His instincts screamed at him to hide, to escape, to do anything but stay in the open. But the door opened, and there she was, Sarah. She stepped into the room, her eyes colder than they'd been when he first met her. It wasn't just the fear in her eyes now, it was something darker, more calculated. She stepped toward him slowly, and her lips curled into a thin smile. You really thought you could get away, she asked, her voice dripping with contempt. You really thought they'd come for you? Ethan's heart plummeted to his stomach as the realization hit him like a punch. She was no longer pretending. She wasn't just the girl who had trapped him. She was part of this. She was one of them, someone who had lured him in with promises of connection, only to trap him in this nightmarish world. She wasn't just a pawn. She was a player. Don't bother, she said, cutting through his thoughts. They know. They know exactly what you're trying to do. There's no way out. No one's coming. And even if they do, they'll never find us. Not in time. Her words were like ice. It took everything in him not to lash out, to try to fight her, fight the truth she was so cruelly laying bare. But his body was exhausted, and his mind was racing with 1,000 different thoughts that all seemed to spiral back into the same dark hole. There was no way out. You see, Ethan, she continued, the outside world doesn't even care. People like you, they think they can just live their lives without consequences. They think they can just swipe right, make connections, and everything will be fine. But it's all just a game. And you're just another pawn. The outside world knows exactly what we're doing, but they're too scared to stop it. Too scared to act. Ethan's mouth went dry as the weight of her words sank in. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't. His voice had left him. She was right. The world didn't care. People like him didn't matter to anyone in power. Suddenly, the room seemed to close in even tighter. The walls felt like they were pressing against him. The cold air, the flashing lights, the distant hum of machines, all of it felt like it was suffocating him. He was nothing. He wasn't even a person anymore. Just a tool in someone else's game. Sarah stepped closer, her gaze locking onto his. You won't escape, Ethan. Not from us. Not from this. The room fell silent, the tension so thick that Ethan could barely breathe. His eyes flicked to the door, the only way out. But it wasn't really an option, was it? There was no escaping this. Not physically. And not mentally. He had survived long enough to learn the truth, but that truth didn't set him free. It trapped him. And as Sarah's shadow loomed over him, Ethan realized that there was no way out. The game was rigged. He was already lost. Ethan's mind was a battlefield. Every thought, every rational plan, seemed to crumble under the weight of his desperation. For what felt like days, perhaps longer, he had been a prisoner, his every attempt at escape thwarted by the network's iron grip. He had tried everything: brute force, stealth, manipulation of the bunker's systems. Yet, each move had only led him deeper into the trap. The walls of the small room felt like they were closing in, and he had reached a point where even hope seemed to slip through his fingers like water. It was the worst kind of betrayal. The network, the people who had orchestrated his downfall, seemed to know him better than he knew himself. They had anticipated his every move, every instinct. They had seen through him with an ease that sent a chill up his spine. The very things that should have been his strengths, his ability to think on his feet, his tech skills, had been turned against him. It was a game. And he was just another pawn. Sitting in the corner of the dim, concrete room, Ethan felt utterly defeated. His hands were still tied, the ropes digging into his wrists, but it wasn't the physical pain that consumed him. It was the crushing realization that no one would save him. The world outside, his friends, his family, the people he had once trusted, were all beyond his reach. They wouldn't know what had happened to him. They wouldn't know that he had fallen victim to a dark web of manipulation, control, and deceit. The trap had tightened. There was no way out. Sarah's words echoed in his mind. She had been the first to break him, to show him the reality of what he was up against. You're just a pawn, she had said. This is bigger than you. It's bigger than anything you can understand. Her cold, emotionless demeanor had stripped away the last of his hope. There were no heroes in this story, no last-minute rescues. Ethan had never felt so small. The isolation of the bunker was suffocating, and for the first time since he had been captured, a single thought bubbled up inside him: I'm not going to make it out of here alive. But even in his darkest moments, a flicker of his old self remained. The tech geek, the problem solver, the person who had spent his life breaking down complex systems. It wasn't gone. Maybe it had been buried for a while, but now, it flared to life. It wasn't over yet. Not if he had a say in it. Ethan's pulse quickened as his hands worked against the ropes once again, a familiar desperation fueling his every move. His thoughts weren't as scattered now. A plan was beginning to take shape, a dim outline in the chaos. He had watched the guards. He had studied their movements, memorized the layout of the bunker. The cameras, the alarms, they were all connected to a central system. And there was one weakness he had observed, a gap in their surveillance. A minor vulnerability in their encryption code. The network might have controlled everything, but even the best systems had their blind spots. Ethan, weakened from days of captivity, felt the surge of adrenaline rush through him as he focused. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He had the skills to fight back. Slowly, carefully, his hands worked on the ropes that bound him. They scraped against his skin, each tug of the fibers a reminder of how much longer he'd been here than he'd wanted to admit. The ropes finally loosened, and with a final pull, they fell away, leaving his hands free. He stood up shakily, feeling his body protest the movement, but he didn't stop. There was no time to waste. He moved across the room, reaching for the equipment he had studied earlier, the monitors, the controls, the network interface. His fingers moved with practiced speed, hacking into the system with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The bunker's security systems flickered in front of him, vulnerable, exposed. Ethan knew he was running out of time. Every second he spent on this was a second closer to being discovered. He didn't have the luxury of being meticulous. His mind raced as he worked. He rewrote code, bypassed security, manipulated surveillance feeds. Everything he had learned from his years as a techie came to the forefront. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he had done it. The system was compromised. For a few precious minutes, the cameras were disabled, and the alarms were silenced. He had a window, a narrow one, but it was all he needed. With shaking hands, Ethan moved toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew it wasn't over yet. Even if he escaped this room, there were still layers of security to get through. But the door creaked open, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he stepped into the unknown. Freedom, he thought. But his joy was short-lived. As soon as he stepped out of the room, a low growl echoed from the hallway. Ethan froze. He had been discovered. A guard rounded the corner, his eyes widening in shock as he saw Ethan standing there. Without thinking, Ethan bolted. He had no plan, no backup. His heart raced, and his breath was erratic as he sprinted down the cold, concrete hallways. He heard the guard shout, his footsteps pounding behind him, but Ethan didn't dare look back. He rounded corners, pushing his body to its limits, his lungs burning with each breath. His heart hammered in his chest as he reached a metal door, his last obstacle. He slammed his shoulder into it, the steel door groaning as it swung open. Ethan stepped into the next room, his eyes searching for anything that could help him escape. He found a small access panel on the wall, a maintenance hatch, his only way out. With one last burst of energy, Ethan yanked the panel open and crawled through, into the dark, narrow tunnel beyond. His body trembled from exhaustion, but he kept going. His feet slapped against the damp concrete, his breath ragged as he pushed forward. Every step was a risk. Every second was a battle. Ethan finally emerged from the underground compound, the night air filling his lungs as he collapsed onto the soft earth. He was free. The cool air against his face was a sweet relief, but even as he lay there, gasping for breath, he knew the fight wasn't over. He had escaped, but the organization was vast, and its reach was far beyond this place. It was a system, a network of predators who had been operating in the shadows for far too long. Ethan rose to his feet, every muscle aching, but a new clarity had formed in his mind. The outside world wasn't safe. It wasn't what he had thought. He could already feel the weight of their influence stretching across every corner of his life. The people he had trusted. The people he thought could help him. They were all pawns, just like him. The realization was sickening. His escape wasn't a victory. It was just the beginning of a much larger nightmare. Ethan made his way back to the city, but even as he did, something gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. He couldn't stop looking over his shoulder, couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia anymore, it was reality. He was being hunted. The network hadn't forgotten him. Days later, as he sat in his apartment, he received a message. It was from an unknown number, the message short and cryptic: "I know what happened to you. I've been watching. Sarah is not who you think she is. You're in deeper than you know." Ethan stared at the screen, his heart racing as the words sank in. He felt his breath catch in his throat. He had escaped, but not unscathed. The person who had sent the message knew everything. They knew about Sarah. They knew about the network. And they weren't the only ones watching. As the message disappeared from his screen, Ethan's face hardened. He wasn't just a pawn in their game anymore. Now, he had a target on his back. But he would make sure they knew one thing: he wasn't going down without a fight. Ethan stared into the camera, his face set in a steely expression. The reflection of the dimly lit room flickered across the screen behind him. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of everything he had been through. "The truth is, we're all just pawns in a game," he said, his eyes unwavering. "But sometimes, you have to turn the board upside down to survive."